Alright, so this is the ramp. It's about 680 feet to impact. I think it's about 1,500 overall to the landing area. So it's about a 1 to 2 minute canopy ride. And we're about ready to go. So I'm gonna go ahead and give Tommy a call. Yo, alright, about geared up, ready to go, about 30 seconds out.
Copy that.
You feel like the wind's picked up a little bit down there?
Say again?
You feel like the wind's picked up a little down there, or about the same?
About the same.
Okay, cool. Feels like they picked up yeah, it feels like they picked up just a little bit up here, so I'm gonna get off of this rock.
Alright, have a safe jump, my bro.
Thanks, dude. I'll see you down there.
Okay, bye.
Peace, man. Three, two, one. See ya. Alright, I think I'm late for my interview. Let's do this. My name is Devon McLaughlin, and I'm a base jumper. Born in Hawaii, grew up in Arizona, lived in Arizona almost my whole life. I'm a very novice base jumper, definitely want to emphasize that. I've been in the sport for about a year now. I've been skydiving for about 10 years, but took the steps to, safely become a base jumper at the beginning of this past year. From a really early age, I noticed that was something that I really wanted to get into at some point in my life. So in the late 90s, as a young kid, I would see these things, see Jeb Corliss on TV. He had like a Discovery show for some time. And, just seeing all these different base jumpers over the years who I didn't necessarily know. There's names that stood out, obviously. It wasn't really like a priority to get around to at any point in time. I was kind of just like, yeah, at some point in time, that's something I would love to do. Eventually found skydiving when I was in college. I just decided to, kind of get my license out of nowhere. All of my friends were moving out, and I decided to, take money I had and get my skydiving license for whatever reason. One of the best decisions I ever made, still don't look back on it. Got that, and then, got some experience in skydiving, developed skills in other areas too over the years, and then that one day, when I was like, oh, one day I'll start base jumping, that one day finally came, last year. I was like, well, I'm getting older. I feel like I have the skill set now and the confidence to safely do this. So, I mean, at the very least, I could try it. And if it doesn't work out, then, I can always get out of it. So I talked to a lot of experienced friends who were already base jumping or had planned to, and tried to figure out kind of the best way to get into the sport. And obviously, skydiving is a pre-qualifier. Base jumping has changed a lot from what it used to be 10, 20 years ago. It used to be where you find someone who was experienced in the sport, and it was very kind of like almost like a black market hobby, where you find somebody on the fringes of society that's in base jumping already, and you hope that they'll be willing to teach you kind of their ways of staying safe, staying alive. Nowadays, it's kind of partially gotten commercialized in a way. It's mostly for the better because base jumpers are more knowledgeable, but there's courses all across the board. It's Miles Dasher doing his course, represented by Red Bull. I mean, he's sponsored by Red Bull, obviously. Apex has their course, or had their course. There's Schuch, all kinds of people. I decided to go Snake River Base with Tom Aiello, who is an incredible instructor. He's been in the game for the last 20, 30 years. He's had his course for about the last 15 years. Had a bunch of friends who actually went through his course and realized it was, I think, the course that attracted me the most because it was the most technical, the most thorough, and the most overall kind of... It's kind of like you look in your phone book and you see people that are just like mom and pop shops that have been in business for 10, 20 years, and it's like they do no marketing and they're still in business because they do good work. It's kind of like Tom's course through Snake River. They don't do a lot of marketing, but they're still in business because they create safe jumpers. So that really attracted me, and I heard just raving reviews about the course itself, and I did 2 courses through Tom, a fundamentals course and then also an object avoidance course, which is, a very important thing to have, especially out here with the dangerous cliffs that we have. And essentially, those were the 2 preliminary steps in starting to base jump. And then from there, it's pretty much a learning experience the entirety of your base career, talking to jumpers, learning how to take experience from people in other sky sports, whether it's paragliding and learning how to address thermals or wind conditions, talking to pilots, talking to skydivers. It's always a learning experience. Essentially, I think people in these different disciplines, whether it's for work or just simply hobbies, they have a much higher fear and anxiety threshold, whether that's something that's genetic. I personally think it might be genetic. Just looking at, like, my dad, for example, he would do things that, my mom would say are a little more reckless, whether it's cliff jumping. He used to be a windsurfer back when we lived in Hawaii, and he's always kind of pushed the edge a little bit, so I might take some of that from him. But I think people naturally have something in them that allows them to deal with stressors in certain situations like that better than others, I think some of it can be learned through exposure, certain amounts of, like, exposure therapy. So in that way, I think by default, it can be hard for me, it can be difficult for somebody who participates in these sports to kind of relay how they deal with emotions to somebody that doesn't participate in them. People in these disciplines do still experience the same emotions. I just think the volume's turned down quite a bit on them. They have a healthier relationship with them. They understand where they have a play and how they can be, like, totally consuming and cause them to not perform as well. Obviously, if you're completely absent of fear, people will say people who do things that are dangerous, whether they're a pilot or they're on tour and war, they're fearless, but there is fear there. They just have less fear than your average person. And I think in base jumping, I came to terms with this pretty quickly. I remember doing some of my first jumps, I was absolutely terrified. I was almost going to pull out the day before the course that I had, because the day before, the instructor that we had is actually, it's pretty deep stuff. He makes you write a will to your family when you first get in the course, to ensure that you're on board, and he writes a will saying that it, basically relieves him of any responsibility for you, participating in this course and potentially dying. So that's something, if you've ever written a will, it's something that writing in the third person from the point of view of you being dead is definitely a very deep kind of cut. It's something that puts things into reality very quickly, and it's something I wasn't really prepared for entirely, which I think is the main reason that he has you do that, because you really have to accept certain levels of, your existential place in this world. So that was a really good thing, and by the time I slept on it, I got like an hour's sleep that night before the first course, and I think I kind of resolved... Should we for that plane? So he has you write essentially a death note or a will to your loved ones, and that's something that definitely brought the realities of base jumping, the possibilities, kind of the forefront of my mind pretty quickly, which, is the reason why he probably has you do it. So that night was pretty hard to sleep. Primarily because of all the things that are going through my mind and the fact that I was going to do my first base jump the next day off of a bridge. And when the next day finally came, I ended up kind of relying on, maybe it's ignorance, or it's just kind of like, this will probably go through all right. This will probably be fine. That's kind of what I landed on. I was like, well, it'll probably go all right. And that could go back to kind of the just natural, my natural inclination or, innate ability to just kind of see stressful or dangerous situations and be like, well, should be all right. So I ended up doing it, and then I think it was a slow road for me personally to slowly kind of trim off that fear. Every jump was just almost debilitating fear in the early stages. The first, I would say, 40 or 50 jumps, starting out, going between, bridges, antennas, doing cliffs, whatever else. It was so much so to where it was almost putting me in danger to where I couldn't even perform to some level because I was so scared to even just jump. But I figured after some time I would get over it, and I wanted to see if I actually... through that whole point, I was not actually sure if I wanted to continue base jumping in a lot of ways. I was like, I thought this was going to be more fun in my head, seeing it from the outside than being inside. And, sure enough, after a while, I kind of started developing this healthy relationship with fear, and I started understanding that, like, obviously, because it's a novel experience, all these new things happening, all the little incremental muscle movements that I had to enact to make sure every jump was successful, they slowly became more ingrained and habitual to where I became more comforted, especially by jumps going through more successfully. And then the only times that I would experience fear, essentially, or overwhelming fear, is when something was kind of new or different. Obviously on every jump, even the jump today, there was an amount of fear going through my head. For one, there's more than usual because I was by myself, so at that point, you don't have ideas for this jump to bounce off someone. 5-mile-an-hour winds, 8-mile-an-hour winds, what does it feel like to you? It's kind of just me up there, so I'm making decisions for myself and ensuring all the success in this jump rides on myself. So there's a heightened level of fear there and anxiety, but there's also an amount of confidence that balances this out. Fear will keep you sharp, but confidence also allows you to kind of trim back fear, it seems like, and allow you to perform over it And competence, I guess, is maybe a better example than fear or than confidence itself. Confidence can be seen as arrogance, but arrogance can lead you to arrogance could essentially lead you to making poor decisions, where competence is almost like a more content version of confidence, I would say. So, over the course of essentially from being a completely new jumper, 0 jumps, to upwards of, I would say, like between like 50 and 60 jumps, when I started like feeling that like the fear was lessened, and I had more of a healthier kind of fear and anxiety response. Along that way, it was almost debilitating kind of anxiety and fear, to where it was like I almost want to pull out the sport entirely. I had to try and balance it and really focus to not let it really influence like my body and the decisions I was making. Like it is almost debilitating in the sense where the fear kind of controls you, and like that makes your body have a response that you don't necessarily mean to consciously have. And I think what helps with that, or what I've noticed, is that there's certain things that you have to accept. Some people are able to accept them from the get-go, but at the same time, I think it might not be until you're confronted with situations and you see things and you realize just how dangerous the sport is that you actually start accepting, or you have to accept the realities of the sport, or you kind of have to get out of it. Otherwise, you're going to continue having these levels of anxiety. And I think one of the biggest things is, accepting your own mortality. Essentially deep-seated questions of, why am I doing this? Am I doing this for the right reasons? What do I get out of this? And then, the deeper ones, like, if I die, am I happy with what I'm leaving here? Am I happy with everything I've done in my life up to this point? And these are things that you actually have to accept. I think in the positive note is that if you do accept them and you are happy with a lot of things you've done, and not saying like you're okay or that you want to die, but you're okay with dying in some amount. Some people are scared of that idea that you're okay with dying. But I think some amount of acceptance of that is very important, and that's something that it's tremendous to come to terms with that in base jumping, because you very well can die tomorrow, this morning, whatever. The positive thing behind that, I think, is and what helps is understanding, especially if you've been surrounded by death, is understanding how short life and how fragile life is, but also how beautiful it is in a lot of ways too. That it could be gone tomorrow, so we should enjoy it today in a lot of ways. And I think something that's something about that that's very freeing is once you kind of accept that, you have a lot of these emotions surrounding fear that are kind of alleviated. You don't have as much of a fear response. You still don't want to die, obviously, but it's not debilitating in the sense that it overwhelms you and it consumes you. So kind of to bring that back, I think like that's another reason, this is kind of like on a tangent, but base jumpers have a way of kind of building bonds with one another, kind of just off the bat, out of nowhere. And I think that is part of it that plays into it, is this acceptance to do these things that are crazy. And also, I mean, that's how it seems on the surface, is it's acceptance to do something that looks incredibly risky or dangerous or stupid. But I think below that, it's actually acceptance of these existential questions and seeing the importance of them, and that a lot of things in day-to-day life are less important. They're not as big of a deal. We're only here for a short period of time. So because of that, I think it filters certain personality traits of people into the sport, and then where a lot of people are on the fringes of society in the sport, and then you get a bunch of these weird people that never really fit in anywhere, and they kind of just click when they meet one another, and it's a really cool thing to see. So to kind of bring that back a little bit, I think the first thing is essentially that first part is you're able to deal with fear and these anxieties when you accept a lot of the realities of the sport and you're genuinely okay with it. Because if you just say you're okay with it, you're only lying to yourself, essentially. The second part is the habituation I was kind of talking about, where, after I did about 50, 60 jumps, for me personally, I started feeling less of a fear response, unless I was kind of confronted with a novel situation. Like, for example, in the last year I did about 150 base jumps. 132 of those were off cliffs, whereas I've done one jump off of a building. If I go and jump a building tomorrow, I would probably be tremendously more terrified than I would be jumping off this cliff. And that's, there's not necessarily any more danger. If anything, cliffs are more dangerous by, statistically speaking, than buildings are. But it's a novel experience, so it's new to me, it's new to my brain, it's new to how I'm processing information. So that's good. Your brain should do that. In base jumping, it's very well known that one of the biggest killers of it is complacency. And like I was saying, the fear response, to base jumping is lessened, like it is to anything that you continuously expose yourself to. Over time, you're less and less fearful of participating in the activity, which is a good thing because it's not overwhelming to you. You have just a healthy enough response, but you take that further and it can turn into complacency, which can turn into carelessness, which is one of the biggest killers in base jumping. It's things go right so often, you assume they're kind of just going to go right sometimes when every single base jump can be fatal, and we kind of lose sight of that because it's going so well, for so long. So it's being aware of that and continuously, ensuring we're following protocol, we're making good decisions, and we're not falling outside of those bounds that I think helps you deal with that. On more of a functional level, I've noticed that one of the biggest things in, actually dealing with the fear on those certain scenarios that might be novel, usually breathing, and it sounds kind of funny, but it's hard for me to even explain because I kind of just snap into focus when I know that I'm going to go through with the jump. There's obviously times where I feel off and I'll bring it back down and I'm not gonna do it. I've walked down from cliffs many times. When I know that I'm going to do the jump, my mind kind of just snaps into focus, and usually the only thing I'm focusing on is the jump, and the only thing I really feel is kind of my breath. And I think I just do it by default. I think when I first started, it was more of a meditative thing where I was actively trying to center my focus, but now I kind of just do it by default, and without even trying, all the noise of the world just gets turned down and disappears, and that's it. When I was first starting, there's obviously more anticipation of the jump itself, negative feelings prior, really sharpening focus, ensuring everything is going up, your pack job before you jump, ensuring that every little fold looks great. Not to say that, you get more careless, but you learn to accept the imperfections in things a little bit more. That said, leading up to a jump now, there's a little bit less or virtually zero anticipation prior. It's not necessarily until maybe the hike up or you're on exit that you actually anticipate certain things. Obviously, if you're in a negative emotional state, you're probably not going to be jumping, or if you're angry, or all these different things that can influence pretty much any day-to-day life, you're probably going to be less inclined to spend 2 hours hiking up to an exit and then actually jumping. I think other than dealing with stress and fear that I kind of already mentioned, big thing that might weight a little more towards the side of kind of theoretical that I've kind of been mulling over more so recently is a lot of base jumpers. It's definitely tossed around and talked about in the community, but listening to your gut is a very big thing, and I think it goes it's almost seen as being underrated in a lot of parts of mainstream society. People think it's kind of foo-foo or out there, but I think if you think about it in a certain way, it makes a ton of sense. Especially if you think about, humans and how humans have developed over millennia. The human brain has basically been developed over eons to do one of the most complex tasks, most complex organic tasks that we know of in the natural world, which is pattern recognition. And it's essentially what your brain is designed to do, is to take in stimuli and information in your day-to-day lives, process that at night when you're sleeping, and then try and make useful models of the world that you can make projections onto to make better decisions for yourself. Even for example in base jumping, if you look up reaction times of how quickly humans react, we are incredibly slow at reacting to things, but we can react quicker if we anticipate what is going to happen and we're already prepared in how to respond to it. So this goes in deeper with the trust your gut kind of feeling, because we both have our conscious perception of reality and an unconscious perception, and sometimes those come through into our conscious mind in the form of emotions and feelings. And I think there's a lot of pattern recognition that we don't necessarily realize is even going on, but our subconscious mind recognizes certain things might be going out of our day-to-day, let's say if it's base jumping, our flow of how we're used to things occurring. So when things don't feel right, our conscious mind might not recognize what is actually happening, but there might be a subconscious abnormality that is recognized that we are not yet conscious of. It could be virtually anything. And in listening to a lot of more experienced base jumpers, it seems like a very, very common theme that it's not just one thing that goes wrong. There's multiple things that seem to lead up to an injury or a fatality or, multiple things like that. And a lot of these were situations where jumpers had a gut feeling about something not feeling right, and then them just kind of disregarding it, not really addressing it consciously. So listening to experienced base jumpers, it seems like a very common thread that they do put much more emphasis on these gut feelings and just something feeling off, especially when you start developing a healthier relationship with fear, and, when things feel have you hypersensitive to the situation. At first, it feels like everything is an incredibly dangerous situation. Over time, it kind of it gets trimmed back, and the most dangerous parts that can go wrong in your activity, specifically base jumping, they become much more prominent. So when you start having these gut feelings, it seems like it's your refined, fear perspective trying to tell you that something's going on. So as your experience increases and your relationship with fear and kind of anxiety gets trimmed back over time, it seems like the most prominent of these situations where it's much more dangerous, you do have that kind of gut feeling. And most people that I've met that are experienced, they experience this sort of gut feeling of multiple situations along the route of, situations where they've been injured or other people have been injured or killed, and they seem to have, partially disregarded them. So I think it's very important, to address or to definitely acknowledge these kind of gut feelings that could be from an underlying processing system that we don't fully understand within ourselves. The second part of that is, how base jumpers essentially prepare for unexpected situations or for, emergency situations. And this is obviously going to change to varying degrees, both between jumpers as well as what objects they frequently jump. I had friends that were in town from Florida, and in Florida there's no mountains, right? So they primarily are jumping off of buildings. They're doing building jumps, urban jumps, off cranes, everything else. And then they come out here and they're doing their first cliff jumps. Whereas on this side of the coast, we're in the Rockies, we have mountains, they're completely legal to jump off of. I have, one building jump and almost 130 cliff jumps. So the difference there is how I'm preparing for jumps in the wilderness versus how they're preparing for jumps in urban environment. If we're going into a wilderness setting where we're, 2, 3, 4 hours away from civilization, we're obviously going to take different precautions before we get into that environment. The most responsible thing is if you're on big walls, we have somebody who's experienced in high-angle rescue. We have equipment that can actually allow us to get down to certain areas. We bring emergency beacons, satellite phones. We bring life straws if we need to, drink puddles of water. I have friends who've been there. If we're in different wilderness areas that are usually patrolled by rangers, we try to assume that they know of our whereabouts, not necessarily of what we're doing, but that we are there in the event we need rescue. There's also preparation and planning on the level of weather and, ensuring that all the conditions are right to optimize the jump and ensure we don't get ourselves in dangerous situations. We ensure we're prepared. If somebody is out of shape, I probably wouldn't bring them along to a jump into a canyon that might take 3 hours to get out of. It might be more dangerous for them to hike out than to do the jump itself. And then on the other side, if you're in urban areas, obviously you're closer proximity to urban environment, to hospitals, to getting help, but there's also another level. There's more risks there too. There's traffic, there's power lines, there's landing on other people, all kinds of different things that can be much more dangerous than things in the wilderness. It's essentially precautionary. We try and ensure we have the training, we have the tools that we need, and hope that emergency doesn't happen. If it does, obviously we try and do the best we can to try and save one another. Most recently in Moab, there was a guy who got hung up and a girl just happened to be there, and she was an experienced climber who was able to free climb up to this guy and rappel him down. That happens surprisingly often because people in base jumping, it's not necessarily their only sport. They have experience rock climbing, they have experience in high angle rescue, they're invested in other sky sports, so they're not just necessarily these renegade people off the grid that this is their only discipline. There are some of those that exist, but most people are much more specialized than we give them, credit for a lot of the times. Being injured to where I actually can't perform the jump is one. Another one is, starting a family. I think having kids and things like that, it should at the very least shift your perspective to realize whose lives it's going to be affecting if you were to be seriously injured, debilitated, or killed, to where you can't actually actively take part in the way you normally would in their lives. So that's a big thing too, considering how much it's going to affect people's lives in certain ways too, especially if you're pushing your limits much more than you are. You're deciding to go from base jumping to wingsuit base jumping, which is like exponentially more dangerous than just traditional base jumping. Then there's also, I would say, unforeseen things that you don't expect, but could be possibilities, like a close friend passing away. If that happens, that it could, very easily shift your perspective. So I'm aware of things like that could be possibilities. So it's hard to really say that I will be in base jumping forever, or that I will be base jumping forever. I could quit base jumping in a month. I don't know. It's it's always you're always assessing risk, and you're assessing, you know, why you're doing it, if you're doing it for the right reasons. So, yeah. Is it hard to kind of, you know, stay connected with friends and family that aren't in base jumping or sky sports? I guess it's similar for a lot of sports, you know, skydiving, base jumping, paragliding. Maybe a little more emphasized in some way for base jumping just because of, you know, the perceived danger and the realistic danger that it has. And I think a lot of these sports, they kind of take over your life in a lot of ways. It's less of a hobby and it's more of a lifestyle for a lot of things, and that's, I think, for, you know, a multitude of different reasons. Like what I was kind of mentioning earlier, how, you know, base jumpers just kind of find this ability to just kind of click with one another. You filter out kind of all the crap, and you just kind of see each other for who they are in a lot of ways. And, you know, not all base jumpers will probably feel the same way in that way. In my experience, it seems that way a lot of times. You know, base jumpers just kind of meet for 30 seconds and they just get along. You share a jump where you could have died, and you guys are just homies after that. So with those kind of deep connections with one another, it can be a little more difficult to relate to other people outside of that sometimes. And, you know, people change in a lot of ways. And, you know, if you were invested in one thing, you know, these sports kind of start consuming your life, and you start spending more time than you ever thought you would have doing them, or more time with these people that you ever thought you were going to. I mean, you spend 2.5, 3 hours hiking to an exit where you're going to spend 3 to 4 seconds in free fall, 1 to 2 minutes under a canopy, and then you guys hug it out and you guys go home. But like that time leading up to that is kind of much more powerful than you might have of, you know, 8 hours doing 8 hours of drinking beers at the bar with your homie that you see like twice a week. Not to knock that, base jumpers definitely party, but, you know, there's just, I think you don't realize how much it's going to take over your life until you do. There's also the side of like how dangerous the sport is, and people not necessarily understanding or understanding why you're willing to put yourself in those risks. You know, usually it comes from family. For whatever reason, I have an incredibly supportive family, probably too supportive to where I almost want to like relay the harsh realities, because I feel that those kinds of people, they trust too much that things are going to be okay, and they might be affected the most when things don't. It's good to remind those closest to you in your life that you're not perfect, and that even when you do everything perfect, things can go wrong, and you might not always be here, you know? So in that way, I think some people do feel alienated from their family, you know, when their family doesn't approve of what they're doing, or they don't even understand fully that they were base jumping and they end up dying, which unfortunately happens. Some people are too scared to share things with their family, and their family doesn't find out until they're really injured, they're killed, which is a really unfortunate thing. Then their family just doesn't even understand why they would participate in this thing to begin with. I think the other thing too is just how powerful like a lot of these sports are, you know, whether it's base jumping, any of these other sports. And the reason they consume your lives, I think, for one, the experience is something you can't really find anywhere. I mean, you can't even find drugs that do, you know, the experience that you get from base jumping, or, I mean, skydiving even too. It's like, I mean, base jumping on its own, it feels like you're breaking reality. You're doing something that the human mind and body wasn't designed to ever do. It goes against everything that your innate emotional state tells you not to do. You're not supposed to jump off a cliff. There's no time in human history where that was an evolutionary characteristic that you should do, you know? So I remember the first few jumps, it felt like it wasn't real. It was like almost easier to deal with like the fear and anxiety, because it felt like, you know, I'm not going to jump off a cliff. I'm not going to jump off of a bridge. So it made it easier to kind of deal with the emotions. It's really unusual in that sense. It feels like a dream. So in that way, that's where it becomes so consuming. It's not even necessarily, like I was saying earlier, the adrenaline, having an adrenaline rush. People say adrenaline junkie. I mean, maybe there are a few people, but adrenaline in itself, the experience is not an enjoyable one. It's one that makes you take action. It makes you, you know, it's a sharp shooting, immediate sense of anxiety that makes you want to take action to fight or flight. So over time, when you become habituated into kind of the sport, it becomes almost more of there's a deeper feeling there, something that almost goes against. It just feels like magic. Is like the easiest way to kind of explain it. So I kind of say these things to try to encapsulate. It's really hard to kind of put into words if you haven't done it, but it's something that it becomes consuming for a lot of people, and I don't think it's even immediate at first either. Like for me, you know, personally, it took, you know, a multitude of jumps for me to actually start having a kind of positive relationship with the sport, where I was pretty rocky on it in the beginning. And then after time, I started realizing kind of the value and the connections I would make with people and the time I was spending outdoors and the kind of the beauty in it, respect for nature and meeting these just incredible people that it kind of consumed my attention and areas of my life. I was getting so much more value from these people that I would just spend a few hours with, each week, so much more so than a lot of other areas of my life. And that was like one of the biggest things that was hard to kind of relate to people. It's not something you can, on the surface, it looks like a bunch of careless people with backpacks filled with fabric just jumping off cliffs, but underneath it, there's so much more going on. And crazy thing too is there was kind of this conception or this perception by the public that most base jumpers are kind of just these reckless people, but most of them, a lot of the Sky community, they're some of the most responsible, intelligent people I've ever met. They're people you would never expect. CEOs of Fortune 500 companies, people that it seems like almost went through these different routes of their life and they didn't find what they were looking for, and then they happened upon maybe base jumping, maybe paragliding, maybe speed flying, whatever, and then they realized that's what they were after all along. Maybe it's the rush of it, maybe it's the connections down deep below, but a surprising number of people that these sports kind of filter, it's kind of no wonder that it kind of took over other parts of their life, and this is what they wanted after it. So I think you start out with the immediate, very simplistic, almost superficial kind of things. You're like, oh, this is sick. I'm gonna look so cool for this. Everybody has some amount of that, right? Humans are social beings. We want to get approval by people. And most people feel ashamed to think that way, but I mean, that's why you get a bunch of, someone murders somebody, you put him with a bunch of other murderers to keep him happy. You put him by himself, he's less happy. We still want social approval and relationships with people no matter what people they are, right? So I think a lot of people feel ashamed when they feel like they want to get some amount of validation, but I think it's pretty important to address that and understand that, and it leads a lot of people to be harsh and criticize people that may seek it more than others. I think a lot of times people who try and seek it more than others, they are some of the people that need it the most. Maybe they, for whatever reason, they had a rough upbringing or anything. And a lot of times they need that because they can't survive without that. I just say that too, in a way, a lot of these sports, I think there is some amount where people want to feel validated, but it could be for different reasons. Some people want to look cool. Some people want to look intelligent. Some people want to just help. They want to feel validation knowing that they made somebody else's life better. They're not all completely self-serving, I think. And that's the reason why humans in a lot of ways I think evolved to be social beings, because we succeed when we're helping others, when we're a net positive for our local community, than when we're just me, which unfortunately a lot of social media has kind of bred a lot of people to be more so that narcissistic way than the group thought. But so I think to kind of bring that back, there's probably some amount of that to me. I'm not fully sure which way I personally think I get validation out of it, but I think it's two-sided. I really enjoy the relationships that I make with people. Obviously, the sport itself, just the action of it, is incredible. I think it's more meditative than it is oh yeah, I need my adrenaline rush today. It's not. It's more of it's something deeper. I don't know if I can really explain it. Maybe that's just my pursuit of wanting to fly or things like that, or whatever. It could be a very superficial emotional response, but I think you start out with these superficial things being fulfilled, and then you stay in it because you are realizing you're getting more out of it, especially if you try and actively develop yourself within the community, or you really do want to try and help people or anything. I think there's deeper lessons that you learn and deeper relationships that you start making, and things that start meaning more to you sometimes than even just jumping itself. I think I'm at a point now where I feel like some of the relationships I've made through even just getting into the sport almost mean more to me than the sport itself, to where, I don't have any plans right now of getting out of the sport, but if I did, I would still really enjoy helping fellow jumpers any way I could.
I'm no king, I'm no god, just a man among a crowd. I don't raise my cup to please. Your livelihood, just a man among crowds.